We're privileged and delighted to have with us a distinguished economist, a prolific writer, a public intellectual with many credentials and intimate knowledge of the Lebanese economy, having served as Minister of Finance for a couple of years, where he has to deal with the very issues we'll be discussing today. Dr. George Corm is professor of economics at St. Joseph University and has taught in many areas of Lebanon and other universities around the world. A distinguished scholar in many respects, but he combines with his scholarly work the expertise and experience of having been in the government dealing with concrete issues, some of which we'll be discussing today. It's a great pleasure to have Dr. George with us. Let me begin by asking you, Dr. George, what sort of crisis do we have now? Some have just considered it to be only financial crisis. Some have added economic crisis as the crisis escalated. But there are many who believe that the crisis is rooted in the political system and in some sense has moral, ethical dimensions. What sort of issues you think have precipitated this crisis?
The crisis today is basically a system built on corruption for so many years, and that was totally inefficient in spite of all the capacities and the possibilities of Lebanon. And the people who were governing Lebanon were living, they didn't have their foot on the soil. They thought that by just giving very high interest rates to depositors, this was enough as a policy, as an economic policy. And this has ruined the country. Today we have to foot the bill.
Yes.
It was 30 years of madness, craziness. The late Prime Minister Rafik Hariri thought that Lebanon was going to sign peace with Israel in the next few months or few years. I think he was intoxicated by his patronage, and so he didn't care, and he saw that our debt would be suppressed by Western countries because we would have established a relation with the state of Israel, the Zionist state.
Yeah. Yeah, the story, Dr. George, is that this crisis could not have exploded at such a magnitude that was not in the making for many years. Is there any structural, any reasons why this crisis had exploded now that was in the making for decades?
Well, don't forget the drama of the 4th of August. It was like a tremblement de terre, shaken earth.
Yeah.
And it gave such damages in Lebanon in terms of life, in terms of traumas for many people. It's something unbelievable.
Well, it seems like what we have today with the COVID, the explosion in the port of Beirut, it was the straw that broke the camel's back. But there were so many imbalances in the Lebanese economy and society. Regional imbalances, where the coastal cities and the trade routes were thriving, but areas in the south and in the Bekaa and in the Hermel areas and in Akkar, the areas were left behind. They were not part of the prosperity or the Lebanese miracle that people talked about. There were sectoral imbalances. Services constitute such a high proportion of the GDP of the country. No country in the world has had as high a ratio contributed by services to its GDP. And this came without going through what other countries have gone through, developing the productive sectors that ultimately were served by an increasing and a more efficient service sector. Lebanon jumped directly from an agrarian and traditional economy into the services economy without going through the productive sectors. There are also issues where that confessional system that saw a mechanism where people were able to access the benefits and the services depending on their loyalty and affiliation with particular sects. Every sect considered itself to be a primary provider of services to its clienteles, created a confessional sort of distribution system and a clientelism where the politicians have thought of their constituencies as clients. How do these factors play into the crisis today?
Oh, yes, of course, they play into the crisis. But if you like, it's the terrible shock of the explosion of the 4th of August last year at the port of Beirut. That has also shown the incompetency of the people managing the states in general. And really, I mean, the trauma, the suffering of thousands of people because of this explosion is something incredible. And everybody knew about this ammonium that was deposited by a mysterious boat some 15 years ago, something like that.
We'll leave it at mysterious. See, the Lebanese economy now is in the throes of a major recession, if not depression. I mean, what we are facing now, in some sense, is a very troubling situation. 40% of the Lebanese working class are unemployed. The economy that used to produce $55 billion US dollars as its GDP in 2019, in 2020, it went down to $33 billion. This is more than a 40% contraction. Half the Lebanese now are considered to be below the poverty line. The dysfunctions are mounting. They're becoming more serious. Cost of living inflation is literally above 80%. Most people are paid in Lebanese pounds, and their cost of living is rising without any balancing or correction for this inflation. Is there an end to this?
Yeah, well, let us first analyze some of the previous policies, especially the trade policies of the late Prime Minister Rafiq Hariri, who had signed free trade agreements with almost the entire world, and especially with countries like Saudi Arabia or other countries that heavily subsidized their exports. And he didn't care about encouraging exports. I mean, his view that someday the international community will come and will pay the debts of Lebanon, especially if Lebanon goes and signs peace with Israel. This was his very naive view, and he he had absolutely no clue to developing industry, the industrial capacity of Lebanon, to ICT, for which Lebanon has a great comparative advantage in the region. Nothing. He was just interested in signing free trade agreements. And even with the European community, usually, I myself, when I was minister, I was asking the European Union for 10, 15 years to adapt to its agreement, and for an amount of at least 500 million euros to modernize the industrial capacity of Lebanon. Well, he went and he signed with the European Union for 10 million euros. Wow. To receive only 10 million euros. So he had this very naive approach that peace was coming and that international community will come and will take care of the financial mess of Lebanon.
Yeah. We have at the moment a floating exchange rate, but we had for several years, especially after the war, a fixed exchange rate system. A fixed exchange rate system that prevented the economy from a shock absorber that could have moderated, could have absorbed some of the shocks. A fixed exchange rate is in the interest of importers, but it militated. It was not helpful to exporters. This has prevented Lebanon from developing an export base and a productive base. At one time, as you probably know more than anybody else, Lebanon was beginning to develop a real viable industrial export base. The fixed exchange rate regime, which kept actually inflating the currency, appreciating the currency, becoming more and more an impediment to export. So what do we do?
Yes, you're right, but not totally. I would disagree a little bit.
Yeah, sure.
Because the biggest prosperity of Lebanon was due to its floating exchange rate in the 50s, the 60s, until came Mr. Hariri and made a fixed rate. And our industries, most of them are light industries. So there is a lot of component being imported to produce what we produce. So the more you had an improvement in the rate of exchange, the more our industries paradoxically became more competitive in the 60s and the 70s. And by the end of 1970, we were exporting something like, at the time, $700 million of industrial exports.
Wow.
We don't have heavy industries, we just have light industries. And the floating rate was a big plus for the Lebanese industries at the time. And then when Harirism came to Lebanon and made the fixed rates at a very high level, as you mentioned, then our industrial capacity were handicapped.
At one time, there was a justification. I myself have contributed to it by saying that after the war, the inflation was incredibly high and we needed a financial anchor. But the trouble is that when you kept a fixed exchange rate and the inflation was going on, that translated automatically into a more appreciated Lebanese pound, so that the fixed exchange rate did not keep it fixed at a level. It became more and more inflated and militated against export.
But here, I mean, the late Prime Minister Hariri went against the international trend because all exchange rates were floating. The international monetary system had quitted, left the fixed exchange rate, and all the currencies in the world were floating one against each other. So when everybody goes to floating, he went to fixed. Total madness. Total madness. And with the level of interest rates that I mean, people were investing in treasury bonds at very high prices, or eventually in the real estate sector. And that was it. And nobody was investing in industry.
No, nobody would. You see, I mean, that's the other side, is that when you have such high interest rate on your deposits and on bonds,
of course,
there is no chance anybody would take the risk in industry and to get a lower rate of profit, lower than the interest rate. So no question about it.
I used to call Lebanon the real estate and banking republic.
Well, it is, and still is, and now more than ever.
Well, no, banking now it's finished.
The government and the banks, backed by the political class, have commandeered the savings of the Lebanese, have put their hands on the savings of people. People now in Lebanon cannot withdraw their money. They have to live by what the banks allow them, which is a small little amount of money that they could withdraw on weekly basis. This is unheard of, in which the government and the bank system would entitle themselves to raid the savings of people. Some of them have gone to the Gulf, to the deserts, to Africa, to very difficult places, to amass this money that they were hoping that it will tide them over when they retire in their old age.
I wouldn't say banks today, I would say mafia. I wouldn't talk of banks. I would say it's mafia economy.
This mafioso-like economic system that some have likened to a Ponzi scheme in which the debt kept ballooning and you pay people very high interest rates by assuming more debt. The debt kept escalating, kept ballooning, with no chance that the economy has the productive capacity to pay these exorbitant high interest rates. And now they all connive, they all stand against a forensic audit of who got their money out of the country. Banks, governments in Europe, in Panama, in many countries, say that the Lebanese own huge accounts abroad. And most of these, apparently, money that was smuggled out by the political class, protected, unfortunately, by the central bank. Some people would like an independent foreign accounting firm to conduct a forensic account and audit of where the money has gone and who has been able to take their money out, and what are the chances that these monies are laundered abroad and the Lebanese people are denied the chance to access their savings.
Except that for the governor of the central bank, the central bank has been accused of money laundering, accused in France, accused in Great Britain, accused in Switzerland.
Wow.
And he's still in place. We have a very courageous Minister of Justice who has tried also to demote him, and she couldn't. She couldn't because apparently he is very well protected by the US.
Yeah, and the political system to a great extent. Our Lebanese political leaders, who for all practical purposes are heads of literally what people would call mafia-like systems, they have exercised all their power to shield the responsible people from any accountability. Why can't Lebanon, as has been demanded and has been to a great extent negotiated, hold a forensic accounting of where the money disappeared? Money does not, like water, evaporate to every transaction. There are two sides, those who pay and those who receive. $360 billion couldn't have disappeared from the banking system overnight without some allowing it to happen. And there is now a two-way balance that could be traced to see where this money goes. Is there any expectation that this money could be recovered? Is there any expectation that a recovery program can be organized to ward off the total collapse of the Lebanese economy?
In my view, they are outside Lebanon,
Yeah.
being transferred outside Lebanon. But as you may know, today the company that has been chosen to do the forensic audit is being prevented to carry on its mission by the fact that the central bank doesn't handle the necessary documents.
Well, in the absence of any sign or any expectation that the people responsible for the crisis or who have not dealt with it, not probably instigated it, but let's say they did not come with any solutions. What would you think could help Lebanon now? I mean, is there any practical or program of recovery that might help Lebanon, put an end to that depression, inflation cycle that we're into? Is there any light?
The government of Hassan Diab, with the cooperation of Mr. Alam Bifani, who was still at the time the Director General of the Minister of Finance, has put a very good plan that even the IMF has said this is a good plan. But then, of course, the plan has been paralyzed by the fact that we had the explosion last year on the port of Beirut, and now today we have a very clean judge, Mr. Tariq Bitar, who is conducting an inquiry to know what happened also in the port. And we are here. The Ministry of Finance still refuses the forensic audit. It has, it's almost forgotten now. It's almost forgotten, unfortunately.
There are many people who always blame foreigners. Say, okay, Lebanese are innocent, it's always the foreign meddling. And we've seen so many evidence of that, where the Saudis, the Americans, the Israelis, the French, the Turks, Iran. There is no question about it that this crisis could have happened without some participation, some instigation, some contribution of forces that do not have the best interest of Lebanon at heart. Who are they? Why are they doing it?
Oh, well, I would, the first personality that comes to my mind is the former President Jacques Chirac of France, who was so close to Mr. Hariri. He used to receive monthly payments from Mr. Hariri. And he protected him. He organized different international conference to support Lebanon. He organized Paris 1, Paris 2, Paris 3.
Sadr.
Sadr also was something totally inconsistent.
How do we account for the fact that what really would have in normal circumstances cost only maybe $2.5 billion to rehabilitate, to reconstruct, to reconstitute, to reinvigorate the economy after the war, all of a sudden mushroomed into billions and billions of dollars?
I remember a big American firm that came after the war, 75, 90, estimated the amount needed for reconstruction in Lebanon to something like $2.5 billion.
Billion.
$2.5 billion.
Yeah.
Then came Mr. Hariri, was furious with this.
Yeah.
So he put it aside and he produced the plan called Afaq Al-Fain, Horizon 2000, to spend $18 billion. And today people have forgotten that Lebanon is 10,000 square kilometer large. And at the time it was 3 million inhabitants. But they took this bad habit to inflate the cost of anything, any investment, any.
And it was all borrowed money to a great extent, and that's why we had such a huge debt to GDP
it
ratio.
was borrowed money because, again, it's the Hariri system organized something that could not last forever. It has put very high interest rates on the Lebanese pounds borrowing of the state, and people would go, they would borrow dollar at 6 or 7%, place them at 20, 30, 35% with a fixed exchange rate without any exchange rate risk, and would pocket extraordinary amount of money.
Yeah, if it's fixed exchange rate, 30% on the Lebanese pound means you're getting 30% on dollars. When the international interest rate was less than 6%.
Exactly.
We are now in the throes of a survival crisis. Lebanon's survival as a country is at stake. We bank on the IMF. We bank on France coming to our help. Is this a true solution? Can we really depend on the IMF? Well, we know from its record all around the world that the IMF is not willing to dish money. It exacts what they call the structural adjustment package, a heavy price on the countries that come to borrow from it. And they have their own dictates. Why can't we depend on us, ourselves? Like the Lebanese diaspora, our economic depth to come to our aid. Why can't we reform the tax system ESQA, the Economic and Social Commission for Western Asia, had estimated that it would take only 0.5% wealth tax to recover and cover and collect the entire debt of Lebanon. Why have we failed to reform the tax system and to bring all those who have benefited so much from Lebanese economic crisis, and what, not one, but many, from the war onward, to pay their fair share? What would it take? How can we, and is it really possible, to raise this money locally?
Well, I love very much, because again, I mean, since the time of President Chirac, French support for Lebanon was to create a dependency on foreign support. I think the government to which I belong with President Hoss and the President of the Republic, General Lahoud, I didn't ask a penny from anybody. I didn't ask a penny. While these were very difficult times where we were kicking out Israeli occupation in Lebanon, I didn't ask a single penny. And I reduced interest rate from 22.5% on 3 months T-bill to 14%. And I paid something like $1 billion of arrears of the state to the private sectors, to the hospitals, to the contractors, and to those who has been expropriated for public utilities. So this shows you how this country was badly managed.
Yeah. I mean, we couldn't be in a crisis today if there were no waste and there were appropriate policies.
We could at least have made a band for the Lebanese pound to fluctuate inside the band.
Yeah.
The entire world was on floating rate, and we stupidly went to fixed rate.
Yeah, yeah. I remember you have come up with a number of suggestions and programs, one of which is that, yes, the public finances are not well managed, and our need for borrowing was to some extent quite a bit rooted in the fact that the government is not raising sufficient revenues. Why would we expect the Lebanese to be, the general public, to be willing to pay taxes that other countries pay? You correctly say that if we were to really get the services that the Europeans and other countries get, then we should be willing to pay taxes in proportion to what the Europeans pay, which is usually, on average, is over 40% of GDP. But the Lebanese lack confidence, lack trust in their government. And they were justified in so many cases, in so many events where they have seen the kleptocracy of the government clipping, extracting the surplus. It's extractive state and raises lots of taxes, but the public don't see the benefits, the rewards, the services that they expect. How can we re-establish that confidence? And how can we persuade the Lebanese to pay a fair share in financing their government?
Well, the biggest scandal here is that you don't have a unified income tax in Lebanon.
Yes.
You pay income taxes separately, real estate here, commerce here, industry there, etc. And not a single income tax, so you don't cumulate your various revenues, which makes that the task, the income pressure on the private sector or on private people is extremely low. Yes. I had the project to unify the income tax, to have even the taxpayer to make just one declaration per year, as in every country. But this was sabotage also and was never implemented when I left. Yeah. VAT was implemented, and I prepared it with the help, technical help of the European Union. People were laughing at the beginning, ha ha ha, Lebanon would never be able to implement a VAT system. And I remember I used to say that, well, if Tunis and Morocco has implemented VAT, there is no reason why we shouldn't be able to do it. And we did it.
VAT is a value-added tax, which is tax on consumption. I mean, many people have felt like, yes, we do not have a tax system that's unified, that's appropriate, that can generate sufficient revenues to meet the obligations of the government. But many people feel also that there are incredible inequities, totally inequitable, and it's a regressive tax system in the sense that the poor people pay a larger share of this tax, and the rich are literally, one way or the other, not shouldering the responsibilities that their wealth and income would obligate them towards the society in which they live. You know, how do we deal with, first, the fact that very few people are paying taxes? Tax dodging in Lebanon is legendary. And how do we make that tax more equitable?
Yeah. Well, I remember under my government, we took measures to increase the amount that the workers can deduct from their income tax to take into account their family needs. We increased it very substantially. And I was preparing a unified income tax so that rich people would really pay a fair share of the income tax. Unfortunately, when I left the ministry, this VAT was kept by my successor government, but the unified income tax was not adopted at all.
Yes. Now, you know, several people saying that even if we have a progressive income tax, even if we have a unified income tax, even if tax compliance is high, quite a number of Lebanese make their income outside Lebanon. That what would work here is not an income tax, that we need to have a wealth tax. Tax on wealth, even a small 0.5 percentage point of the value of wealth, we could collect the full deficit. ESCWA, which is the United Nations Economic Social Commission that's in Beirut, has undertaken a study where it showed that 0.5% tax on wealth, when you have a comprehensive accounting of this wealth, is sufficient to raise enough money to pay all the deficit that we don't need to go into debt.
Yes, yes, absolutely. Just the fact to unify the different income tax that you have now to making a single income tax on your total revenue, this would bring in a lot of additional receipt to the state. There is no doubt about that. And you know what happened also was ridiculous after the war from 75 to 90. Mr. Hariri came and he reduced the income tax. The income tax at the time was going as high as 43%. He reduced it from 2 to 10%.
Yes.
And then I raised it again, at least from 2 to 20%. But we've never seen after a war governments reducing taxes.
Yeah.
It's ridiculous, absolutely ridiculous.
It is. Okay, yeah, sorry, go ahead, George.
No, and then you always have a special tax for those people who has become richer during the war.
Yeah. The story is many Lebanese feel that, all right, there is a lot of room to improve and reform the tax system. And the willingness of the Lebanese to pay taxes is not independent of their confidence that whatever money the government collects will be spent wisely and appropriately. And many people feel that there is a lot of waste in government, and more importantly, a lot of fraud and graft. And that there are legendary stories of monies, huge billions of dollars allocated to build universities that were never built, to construct roads that were not constructed, to establish hospitals in the qada, in the different governments. That was not. So to what extent are these independent or need to be brought together?
No, I have some reservation about this statement. What I used to say to people when I was minister, and they were complaining about public services not working properly, I used to say to them, well, look, if you want to have public services, like France have it, or Sweden have it, or Austria have it, then you have to pay not 14% of GDP as taxes. We have to go as high as 40% of GDP in taxes. Then we can give the same quality of services that country of OECD region could give to their people. But as long as it is so low and you don't agree to any increase in income tax, I'm sorry, you receive the public services that can be given with such a low level of taxation. That's it.
You're absolutely right. I mean, you want to really get the services that other European and advanced countries, you should have the same tax ratio to GDP they collect. But still, the issue is, to what extent has Lebanese political class dipped its hand into public purse that makes lots of Lebanese worry and wary about whether they should contribute these percentages?
No, but look, the habit was taken. If you like, before our war, 75, 90, we had a budget surplus. Under President Fuad Shihab, taxes were paid, and the tax rate was going as high as 4%. It was not a joke. When Mr. Hariri arrived, is that, as I told you, the thing costing, for instance, reconstruction estimates $2.5 billion was changed to $18 billion. Yeah. So any infrastructure that you would develop would cost 10 times its real cost. And the difference would go into the pockets of corrupted politicians.
Yeah, exactly. That's the real issue. Okay, you and I, Dr. George, and a group of social scientists, Dr. Samir Mahdisi, Dr. Hudazre, Dr. Nwayhid, and Dr. Bizri, we're getting together trying to see if there is a way we can reconstruct, reconstitute, rehabilitate the public finances in a way that would allow Lebanon to extricate itself from this grip of cumulative recessions that are coming, and the story is getting worse. We have inflation that triggers depreciation that requires really further depreciation as inflation is fed. We have a vicious circle. Where do we break it?
Yes, but again, Dr. Kubursi, we have to stop inflating the cost of investment in Lebanon. To rehabilitate 1 kilometer of road, which should cost certainly not more than $500,000, is costing $10 million or $15 million. And this is a bad habit. This is now ingrained mechanism of corruption in Lebanon.
Yes, absolutely. The French seem to have come up with a plan for Lebanon. Many of its aspects and proposals, a good number of them are reasonable. But why should we succumb to foreign dictates, foreign preferences, foreign agendas? And these have proven in many instances, even historically, look, at one time, the Europeans have lent Egypt, the Khudaiwis, incredible amount of money to build the Suez Canal, only to ultimately say, all right, you can't pay, then we take control of the canal. So why can't we learn that there are no foreign government is willing to dish money and to deny their people this money and give it to the Lebanese without these governments aiming and trying to extract collateral benefits to themselves? Why is Lebanon willing to trust this? And why doesn't Lebanon take the option, the Eastern option? Always, we're from the West, we trust the West, we should go with the West. Oh my God, the Russians, the Chinese, the Iranians, so many forces and governments and parties who have also interest in influencing Lebanon have come with programs and with packages to aid Lebanon. And then these countries are capable. I mean, China alone has about $3 trillion, $3 trillion US dollars, a surplus that they could use. They're using it to build the Silk Road, and they built in Israel, the port of Haifa. Why is it that we only seek help from Western countries and do not open the bidding war here or the bidding program so that we see different parties compete and we will use and we will choose the one that serves us best?
But first of all, I think that we should put our feet on earth because the costs, the way projects are costed is only a reflection of the corruption in the economy. We are only 10,000 square kilometers. When I see the figures of the investment required to upgrade our infrastructure, for instance, it seems to me that we are a huge country of 40 million people, of 200,000 square kilometers. It's a scandal. It's a scandal with 10,000 square kilometers. It's a mini state, Lebanon, mini states. So all this has to stop. And all the conferences, Paris 1, Paris 2, said and not said, was just maintaining Lebanon as if Lebanon was a huge country needing billions and billions of investment. No, look at the map. What is Lebanon? It's so small a country. So we have to get back on earth.
Yeah.
and to have control, cost control.
Yeah. It's difficult to be totally pessimistic. One shouldn't. I mean, people know that sometimes economists, by predicting dire situations and others, become self-fulfilling prophecies. There is a silver lining in Lebanon that should not be ignored. We have 4 dynamic lights at the end of the tunnel, so to speak. One of which is the oil and gas. To what extent can we protect and exploit our share of this oil and gas in the Mediterranean that would back us and provide a cushion for us? But it should be a very well-guarded cushion. We should not really squander this wealth that we have. And we cannot afford to leave it to the hand of corrupt politicians who probably would use it to their own interests, as I have done so much and so well before. There are some of us thinking that we should establish a trust fund, Treuhand, like when the East Germany got its independence, and as the Soviets withdrew, they put all this wealth they had into that trust fund, and we could maybe invite Lebanese diaspora to contribute to it. But it should be managed by these people who contribute, and should only be used to invest in productive capacities that can transform the Lebanese rentier economy, unproductive economy, to a productive one. And many of them might not even want a fast reward. And we can reward them, as they've done in many different examples, by the rate of increase of GDP. Okay, you don't get any fixed amount, you get a variable amount. And their variable amount depends on the growth rate of the GDP. If it is 5%, you get 5%. If it is 2%, you get 2%. But there is also something that is extremely important here, is how do we get the diaspora as our economic depth to contribute? See, if every family of the millions of Lebanese in Brazil, in Australia, in Africa, in the Gulf, contributed a small amount, that would be sufficient. A back of the envelope calculation, it could generate between $6 and $10 billion. The kind of money that we are begging for from the IMF. But we have to give the diaspora a hope that this money would not be squandered, would not be stolen, would be used effectively. One way is probably to get them involved, not only in dishing the money, but in allocating this money. Look, Lebanon has great potential. The wealth of Lebanon is its people. Very highly educated, entrepreneurial, have proven their capacities, have proven their worth in so many areas. They have succeeded in very difficult circumstances all around the world. Why won't they be successful in Lebanon?
No, but I believe what we can do is to produce a plan for the future, whereby I would put on the top of the agenda the monetary policy of Lebanon.
Yeah.
And secondly, the abolition of all these crazy free trade agreements. I would go to WTO, say, look, sorry, I have a problem. I have to suspend all these free trade agreements. We cannot continue with these free trade agreements. And this is the way to go without it. And to prepare to have a new Lebanese pound that would have a real value.
Yes.
Today we even have in Lebanon, if you take only the illegal properties on the Mediterranean shores that we have, we can get out of this billions of dollars.
Absolutely.
I think that without going to dig under the water at 3,000 kilometers, if there is oil and gas. Let's see in the Bekaa Valley in the 60s. We knew that there was oil resources in the Bekaa Valley. Why don't we look there?
Yeah. You mentioned something very interesting, Dr. George. And what I really like is this idea that Brazil has used. Brazil, everybody tells Brazil, don't really use the Amazon, the rainforest, which to some extent is what's left as part of the lung of the world. Don't slash and burn. They say, all right, you don't want us to slash and burn and produce cattle and industry and agriculture. We will put this in escrow. We will keep it as is. But then all the countries of the world who are saying that this is our lung, you have to come to the table with some money that we can somehow compensate our people for foregoing the economic advantages they could reap from the rainforest. Why can't we say the Mediterranean, which is a pond, which is a small amount, that we will preserve its clarity, its cleanliness, its environmental functions. We will put it in escrow, no more any activity that will pollute it, but then all the riparians that are around the Mediterranean, from the extreme west all the way to the east, will have to fork the money to Lebanon. I will put this as one of the, what you call it, the collateral, so to speak, to the debt of Lebanon.
But you can also, think of the sun. You can have a lot of electricity produced cleanly by the sun that we have.
Solar energy. Yeah.
Solar energy.
Yeah.
We shouldn't be spending $1 on non-solar energy in Lebanon.
Yeah, but then you bankrupt all these people corruptly, literally selling the generator that pollutes and exploit people's needs. There are so many green and sustainable alternatives to the mess that we are in. It's not hopeless. We need the political will. We need the people, the clean people who come to the table and, see that these projects are implemented. I don't think it's hopeless, but as long as we are under the grip of a corrupt mafioso system, if the people of Lebanon have any chance to wrestle the power into their hands, and if they will extricate themselves from that clientelist system that makes them in servitude to their sectarian and militia leaders, that's the option. And in the absence of this option, our future is not very bright.
Yes, unfortunately.
Can we reform? Can we redevelop? Can we restructure our banking system, our political system, our governance system in such a way that we could weed out corruption? Are you optimistic, pessimistic? Are you willing to gamble on the Lebanese people who have been called, the best example of survival and resilience? They have extricated, reborn again from the ashes. Why can't they do it this time?
Because in my view, you have in the mind of any Western decision maker, what he considers essential is to forget about Palestinian rights and to make relations with the state of Israel.
Yeah.
This is what is in the mind of any decision maker in the West, unfortunately.
Unfortunately.
And this would be the end of Lebanon also. So,
we have come to an end of our program. This has been a fascinating discussion, and we couldn't have done it better with anybody other than Dr. George Corm, who is not only par excellence one of the top intelligentsia of Lebanon, but also a person with experience in policy making, who sat in the hot seats of governments. But with people with such experience, dedication, and commitments, there is hope at the end of the tunnel. And we're also hoping, Dr. George, you will join us in many more sessions to benefit from your insight and from your experience and your expertise. Thank you very much.
I wish you all the best for your activities. Great activities. Please continue.
Yeah.